back into a world I had really left forever, a universe in which nothing existed except in physical terms, a world in which communications from any other realities or dimensions were impossible. Yet, we continued to have Seth sessions twice a week. I began to have out-of-body experiences, astral projections, as I sat in the living room speaking for Seth. Seth described what I saw while my own consciousness was miles away, perceiving locations and events in another town or state. Our files contain statements from two brothers in California, for example, asserting that Seth correctly described their home and neighborhood while I spoke for him in Elmira, New York, some 3,000 miles away. I could hardly deny those facts. Following publication of my earlier book, letters came from strangers asking for help or advice. Finally, I agreed to hold a few sessions for those most in need, though the responsibility frightened me. The people involved didn't attend the sessions since they lived in other parts of the country. Yet, they said the advice helped them. Information given concerning individual backgrounds was correct. Seth often explained problems as the result of unresolved stresses in past reincarnational lives, and gave specific advice as to how the individuals could use their abilities now to meet these challenges. Before this, I had suspected that the reincarnational data was a delightful dish of fantasy cooked up by my own subconscious. When all this began, in fact, I wasn't at all sure that we survived death once, much less over and over again. Rob and I were hardly religious in conventional terms. We haven't been to a church in years, except to attend weddings or funerals. I was brought up a Catholic, but as I grew older, I found it more and more difficult to accept the God of my ancestors. Irony whispered that he was as dead as they were. The heaven that had sustained me as a child seemed in my teens to be a shallow mockery of meaningful existence. Who wanted to sit around singing hymns to a father god, even if he did exist, and what sort of intelligent god would require such constant adoration? A very insecure, appalling, human kind of god indeed. The alternative, that of hellfire, was equally unbelievable. Yet, the conventional God of our fathers apparently sat without a qualm with the blessed in heaven, while the devil tortured the rest of the unlucky dead. That God, I decided, was out. I would not tolerate him as a friend. For that matter, he didn't treat his son too well either, as the story goes. But Christ you could at least respect, I thought. He'd been here. He knew how it was. Before I was 20 then, I'd left behind me the archaic God, the Virgin, and the communion of saints. Heaven and hell, angels and devils were dismissed. This particular group of chemicals and atoms I called me would fall into no such traps, at least none that I could recognize. Rob's background was different. His parents' brand of religion was a sort of social Protestantism, rather delightfully innocent of dogma. In general, God loved little boys and girls with starched shirts, acceptable addresses, polished shoes, and fathers who made good money. It also helped if their mothers baked cookies for the PTA. Neither of us was bitter about such a God's apparent injustices. We didn't pay him much attention. I had my poetry. Rob, who is an artist, had his painting. Each of us felt a strong sense of contact with nature. No one was more surprised than I was then to find myself quite abruptly speaking for someone who was supposed to have survived death. I berated myself at times, thinking that even my Irish grandmother would have found spirits in the living room rather hard to take, and I used to think she was superstitious. A surviving soul seemed part and parcel of the adult's nonsense I'd thought I'd escaped, thanks to a college education, a quick mind, and a fine dose of native rebelliousness. It took me a while to discover that I was being as prejudiced against the idea of survival as some others were for it. Now I realize that while I was priding myself on an open-mindedness, my mental flexibility extended only to ideas that fit in with my own preconceptions. Now I know that human personality has a far greater reality than we are usually prepared to give it. Someone has produced over 50 notebooks of fascinating material, and even at my most skeptical moments, I have to accept the reality of the sessions and the material. The scope, quality, and theories of the material, quote-unquote, hooked us almost at once. Rob and I are both convinced that the Seth material springs from sources beyond myself, and that it is much less distorted by pat, conventionalized symbolism than are other paranormal scripts we have encountered. Seth says this material has been given by himself and others in other times and places, but that it is given again in new ways for each succeeding generation through the centuries. The reader will have to make his own judgments, but personally I do accept his theories as valid and significant. Moreover, the riddle of such personalities as Seth, call it spirit possession or daemon as Socrates did, has concerned mankind through the ages. The phenomenon is hardly new. Through telling my own story and presenting the material, I hope to throw some light upon the nature of such experiences, and to show that human personality has abilities still to be tapped, and other ways to receive knowledge than those it usually employs. The Seth material has completely changed my ideas of the nature of reality, and reinforced my sense of identity. No longer do I feel as I did before, that man is the slave of time, illness, decay, and at the mercy of built-in destructive tendencies over which he has no control. I feel in control of my own destiny as never before, and no longer ruled by patterns subconsciously set during my childhood. I don't mean to imply that I feel myself entirely released from every worry and fear, only that I now know we do have the freedom to change ourselves and our environment, and that in a very basic manner, we ourselves form the environment to which we then react. I believe that we form our own reality, now and after death. The purpose of this book is to introduce you to Seth and the Seth material. Though Seth has appeared only once in a physical materialization, Rob has seen him clearly enough to paint a portrait of him that hangs in our living room. Through me, Seth has produced a continuing manuscript that runs well over 5,000 double-spaced typewritten pages in not quite 5 years' time. I know many quote-unquote living persons who haven't produced that much in a lifetime. Yet my own work continues. Since the sessions began, I've written 2 books of nonfiction, not counting this one, 2 of poetry, and a dozen short stories. Seth certainly hasn't quote-unquote stolen any of my own creative energy for his own purposes. The first chapters of this book will deal with the emergence of Seth's personality and the impact he had on our lives as we tried to understand what was happening. Out of nowhere, it seemed, I found myself having experiences that I considered nearly impossible. Never in our lives had we found ourselves so caught between curiosity and caution, so fascinated and baffled. Excerpts from some of the early sessions will also be included in the first chapters, since Seth's ideas were then as new and strange to us as the sessions themselves. But the main emphasis will be on the story itself, from the first Ouija board experiment through the first instance when I startled Rob and myself by speaking for Seth, and the changes in our attitudes as further developments occurred. I'll also include examples of Seth's clairvoyant abilities. The bulk of the book will deal with Seth's ideas on various subjects, such as life after death, reincarnation, health, the nature of physical reality, the God concept, dreams, time, identity, and perception. I'm sure that these excerpts from the material itself and some sample reincarnational readings will give most readers greater insights into their own personalities and the situations in which they find themselves. I hope that Seth's theories on health will benefit all my readers, and that the material on personality will help each discover for himself the multidimensional reality that is his heritage. The philosophical and psychological implications of mediumship and ESP phenomena, and the possible origins of the Seth material, along with several questions concerning Seth's independent reality, will be considered. I'll also give Seth's advice as to the development of psychic abilities. Someone who was familiar with psychic literature and paranormal experiences would have been better prepared for these events than I was, but I would not have missed them for the world.